In the heart of downtown Chicago on a chilly winter morning, the courthouse buzzed with its usual energy. Lawyers hurried through the corridors clutching stacks of papers, while citizens waited anxiously for their turn in front of the judge. Among them stood Elijah Johnson, an elderly homeless man whose presence seemed out of place amidst the polished floors and stern faces. Elijah was no stranger to hardship. At 67 years old, life had dealt him more blows than blessings. He wore layers of tattered clothes to shield himself from the biting cold, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a worn-out Bible, the only possession he carried everywhere. Elijah had been arrested the previous night after seeking refuge in an abandoned building. The temperature had dropped dangerously low, and with nowhere else to go, he thought the empty structure would provide some shelter. But instead of finding warmth, he found trouble. A security guard spotted him huddled in a corner and called, "The police." Within minutes, Elijah was handcuffed and taken to the station, charged with trespassing on private property. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but it was the first time he'd ended up in court. The courtroom was packed when Elijah's case was called. Judge Harold Whitaker, a middle-aged man known for his no-nonsense attitude, sat behind the bench, scanning the room with a look of indifference. To him, cases involving minor offenses were often tedious and predictable. As Elijah shuffled forward, escorted by a bailiff, Judge Whitaker barely glanced at him. Instead, his eyes flickered over Elijah's disheveled appearance, his frayed jacket, scuffed shoes, and unkempt beard, and immediately dismissed him as yet another unfortunate statistic in the city's overcrowded justice system. The prosecutor began presenting the charges against Elijah, painting him as someone who deliberately broke the law. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said confidently, "the defendant knowingly entered private property without permission, violating Section 19-4 of the Illinois Criminal Code. This is not the first time such incidents have occurred, and if we allow these actions to go unpunished, it will set a dangerous precedent." The words echoed in the silent courtroom, each one landing like a hammer blow on Elijah's fragile frame. Elijah tried to speak up, his voice trembling as he explained that he hadn't meant any harm. "I just wanted a warm place to stay," he said softly, almost pleadingly. "It was so cold outside and I didn't know where else to go. I didn't think anyone would mind." His explanation, however, fell on deaf ears. Without legal representation or eloquence to back him up, his words came across as weak and unconvincing. The prosecutor smirked, clearly satisfied with how things were unfolding. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft laugh under his breath. To him, this was a cut and dry case. Elijah Johnson was guilty, plain and simple. There was nothing extraordinary about the situation. It was just another example of a homeless person making poor decisions. The judge already had his mind made up, ready to deliver a verdict that would send Elijah back onto the streets with little more than a slap on the wrist. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the judge prepared to announce his decision, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak. Everyone turned to see who had interrupted the proceedings. Standing in the doorway was a striking figure, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with piercing eyes and an air of authority. She walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Every head in the room followed. Her movements, curiosity piqued by her commanding presence. When she reached the front of the courtroom, she introduced herself in a clear, confident voice. "Your Honor, members of the court, my name is Victoria Langston, and I am here to represent Mr. Elijah Johnson." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one could believe what they were hearing. How did a high-profile attorney like Victoria Langston end up defending a homeless man accused of trespassing? It was unheard of, almost surreal. Victoria wasted no time explaining her involvement. "I heard about Mr. Johnson's case through a local outreach program dedicated to helping underserved communities," she said, addressing the judge directly. "After reviewing the details, I felt compelled to step in. This isn't just about one individual. It's about holding our justice system accountable to treat everyone fairly, regardless of their circumstances." Her words hung in the air, silencing even the most skeptical observers. For Elijah, it was as though a lifeline had been thrown to him in the nick of time. He stared at Victoria, his eyes wide with disbelief. Was this really happening? Could someone as powerful and influential as her genuinely care about his plight? As Victoria took her seat beside Elijah, she leaned close and whispered, "Don't worry, Mr. Johnson. We're going to get through this together." Her calm assurance brought a flicker of hope to Elijah's weary face. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker watched the exchange with growing unease. He couldn't deny the gravity of the moment. Victoria Langston's arrival had transformed what should have been a routine hearing into something far more significant. Little did he know, this case would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, justice, and humanity. Victoria Langston's presence in the courtroom was nothing short of electrifying. As she settled into her seat beside Elijah, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Gone was the casual indifference that had filled the room just moments earlier. Now every eye was fixed on her, some curious, others skeptical, but all undeniably intrigued. She exuded confidence, her posture straight and her gaze steady as she opened her briefcase and began organizing her notes. Elijah, still reeling from the shock of having such a formidable advocate by his side, sat quietly, clutching his Bible tighter than ever. The prosecutor, who until now had seemed so certain of victory, suddenly appeared uneasy. He glanced at Victoria, then at Judge Whitaker, clearly trying to gauge how this unexpected turn of events would affect the case. The judge himself looked equally unsettled. Harold Whitaker prided himself on maintaining control over his courtroom, but Victoria's arrival threatened to upend everything. Her reputation preceded her. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was known for taking on cases that others deemed unwinnable, especially those involving systemic injustices. And here she was, defending a homeless man accused of trespassing, an act that most people wouldn't even blink at. Before proceedings resumed, Victoria leaned toward Elijah and spoke softly. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone warm yet professional, "I want you to trust me. We're going to do everything we can to make sure your voice is heard today." Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For years, he had felt invisible, like society had forgotten he existed. But now, sitting next to someone who not only saw him but believed in him, he felt a spark of hope ignite within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. When the judge called the court back to order, Victoria rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "before we proceed further, I'd like to address a critical issue regarding the charges against my client." She turned slightly to face the prosecutor, her expression unreadable. The property owner failed to comply with Illinois state law requiring clear signage indicating that the premises are off limits. Without proper no trespassing signs displayed, the charge of trespassing cannot legally stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Others sat silently, captivated by Victoria's argument. The prosecutor frowned, scrambling to respond. "Your Honor, while there may not have been explicit signage, it's common knowledge that abandoned buildings are private property," he countered quickly, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Victoria didn't miss a beat. "Common knowledge is not sufficient grounds for prosecution, Your Honor," she replied smoothly. "The law exists to protect individuals from arbitrary enforcement. If we allow vague assumptions to dictate guilt, we risk undermining the very principles of justice this court is meant to uphold." Her words resonated deeply, not just with the judge but also with those watching from the gallery. People began nodding in agreement, murmuring their support for her logic. Even Elijah, who had spent decades feeling powerless, found himself sitting, taller in his chair. For the first time, he realized that maybe his situation wasn't hopeless after all. But Victoria wasn't done yet. Sensing an opportunity to broaden the conversation beyond Elijah's specific case, she continued. "This isn't merely about whether or not Mr. Johnson trespassed," she said, her voice rising slightly to emphasize her point. It's about addressing the larger societal failures that led him to seek shelter in an abandoned building in the first place. Homelessness is not a crime, it's a symptom of deeper systemic issues. Instead of punishing individuals like Mr. Johnson, we should be asking why our communities lack adequate resources to support them. The courtroom fell silent. You could hear a pin drop as Victoria's words sank in. Her passionate plea struck a chord with everyone present, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, inequality, and the cracks in the system. Even Judge Whitaker, whose initial amusement had given way to irritation, now looked thoughtful. He adjusted his glasses and studied Victoria carefully, as if seeing her, and the case, through new eyes. To drive her point home, Victoria presented evidence supporting her claims. She produced photographs of the building where Elijah had sought refuge, showing no visible signs warning against entry. She cited legal precedents where similar cases had been dismissed due to insufficient signage. She even shared statistics highlighting the growing homelessness crisis in Chicago and across the country. Each piece of information added weight to her argument, painting a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of trespassing the prosecution had tried to sell. As Victoria wrapped up her presentation, she turned to Elijah and gestured for him to stand. "Your Honor," she said, "this man deserves to be seen, not as a criminal, but as a human being who has endured unimaginable hardships. Let us not lose sight of that fact as we move forward." Elijah hesitated for a moment before standing, his legs shaking slightly beneath him. Under Victoria's encouraging gaze, he mustered the courage to speak. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," he began, his voice trembling but sincere. "I didn't mean to break any rules. I just wanted to survive. It gets so cold out there, sometimes you don't know what else to do." His words hung heavy in the air, raw and honest. Several people in the gallery wiped away tears, moved by his vulnerability. Even the bailiffs, usually stoic and detached, exchanged sympathetic glances. Judge Whitaker, who had started the day expecting a quick resolution, now looked conflicted. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though trying to process everything he had heard. By the time Victoria finished her arguments, the mood in the courtroom had shifted entirely. What had begun as a routine hearing had transformed into something much bigger, a reckoning of sorts. Victoria Langston had not only challenged the legality of the charges against Elijah Johnson, but had also forced everyone present to reflect on the broader implications of his case. Justice, it seemed, was no longer a straightforward concept. It was messy, complicated, and deeply human. And as the judge prepared to deliberate, one thing was clear. Elijah's fate, and perhaps the future of countless others like him, now rested in hands far wiser and more compassionate than anyone had anticipated. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The weight of Victoria Langston's arguments hung heavy in the air, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the case and about themselves. For Elijah Johnson, sitting quietly beside Victoria, this was more than just a legal battle. It was a moment of reckoning. His entire life had been defined by struggle and invisibility. But now, for the first time, he felt like someone was truly fighting for him. Victoria wasted no time pressing her advantage. With precision and poise, she dismantled the prosecution's arguments piece by piece. She began by addressing the lack of proper signage on the property where Elijah had sought shelter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "Illinois law is clear. Private property owners must post visible no trespassing signs if they wish to enforce trespassing laws. Without these signs, any claim of trespassing becomes invalid. This isn't just a technicality, it's a safeguard designed to protect individuals from arbitrary enforcement." The prosecutor tried to counter, arguing that common sense should dictate the rules. "Surely, Your Honor, we can agree that abandoned buildings are inherently private spaces," he insisted, his tone growing increasingly defensive, but Victoria was ready. "Common sense does not override the law," she shot back, her words sharp yet measured. "If we allow assumptions to replace legal requirements, We risk creating a system where anyone can be penalized based on subjective interpretations. That's not justice, it's chaos. Her rebuttal left the prosecutor floundering, grasping for a response that wouldn't undermine his position further. Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker scribbled notes furiously, his brow furrowed as he processed the implications of Victoria's points. It was becoming painfully obvious that the prosecution's case was built on shaky ground, but Victoria wasn't content to stop there. Knowing that this case had the potential to spark broader change, she shifted her focus to the root causes of Elijah's actions. She painted a vivid picture of the challenges faced by homeless individuals, emphasizing how systemic failures often left them with no choice but to break minor laws in order to survive. Mr. Johnson didn't enter that building out of malice or disrespect, she explained. He did so because he was desperate. On that freezing night, he needed shelter to stay alive. Should we punish him for trying to survive? Or should we ask why our society fails to provide adequate resources for people like him? Her words resonated deeply with those in the courtroom. Members of the public gallery exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others wiped away tears. Even the bailiffs, who typically maintained an air of detachment, seemed moved by her impassioned plea. One elderly woman in the front row whispered to her companion, "She's right. We can't keep blaming people for being poor." To bolster her argument, Victoria presented additional evidence. She showed photographs of overcrowded shelters and long lines at soup kitchens, illustrating the scarcity of resources available to Chicago's homeless population. She cited studies showing that affordable housing shortages and mental health crises were key contributors to homelessness, and she highlighted stories of other individuals who, like Elijah, had resorted to desperate measures simply to endure another day. When she called Elijah to testify, the room fell utterly silent. Elijah stood slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing of the witness stand. Victoria guided him gently through his testimony, asking questions that allowed him to share his story without overwhelming him. "Can you tell the court what led you to seek shelter in that building?" she asked softly. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice wavering as he spoke. "I lost my job years ago when the factory closed down," he began. "After that, everything fell apart. I couldn't pay rent, so I got evicted. My family, well, they stopped talking to me after a while. I don't blame them. I wasn't much fun to be around anymore. So I ended up on the streets." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "That night it was so cold. I could feel my fingers going numb. I saw the building and thought maybe it would be safe to stay there for a few hours. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just wanted to live." His words struck a chord with everyone present. There was a raw honesty in his voice, a vulnerability that made it impossible to dismiss him as merely a defendant in a trespassing case. Several jurors dabbed at their eyes, visibly moved by his plight. Even Judge Whitaker, whose stern demeanor had rarely wavered throughout his career, looked troubled. He glanced at Elijah, then at Victoria, as though weighing the moral implications of the verdict he would soon deliver. The prosecutor attempted one last pushback, questioning whether Elijah's circumstances excused his actions. "While we sympathize with Mr. Johnson's situation," he argued, "the law is the law. Allowing exceptions sets a dangerous precedent." But Victoria was prepared for this line of reasoning. "Sympathy is not what we're asking for here, Your Honor," she countered. "We're asking for fairness. If the law itself is flawed or inconsistently enforced, shouldn't we address those flaws instead of punishing individuals for surviving within a broken system?" Her final statement brought the courtroom to a standstill. People sat in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of her words. For many, this was more than just a trial. It was a mirror reflecting societal inequities they had long ignored. As Victoria concluded her arguments, she turned to face Judge Whitaker directly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, "this case represents an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to justice, not just for Mr. Johnson, but for all those who have been marginalized and overlooked. Let us choose compassion over condemnation, and let us use this moment to pave the way for meaningful change." With that, she returned to her seat, placing a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Whitaker announced a recess to deliberate. As the courtroom emptied, whispers buzzed among spectators, each person grappling with the emotional weight of what they had witnessed. For Elijah, the weight felt endless, but Victoria remained steadfast by his side, offering words of encouragement and reminding him that they had done everything they could. By the time the judge reconvened the session, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had begun as a routine hearing had evolved into something far greater, a chance to redefine justice and humanity. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear Judge Whitaker's decision. Little did they know, the verdict would ripple far, beyond the walls of the courthouse, sparking conversations and changes that would impact countless lives, including Elijah's own. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Harold Whitaker returned to the bench. The courtroom, which had been abuzz with whispered conversations during the recess, fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. His expression was unreadable, calm, but contemplative, as though he were carefully weighing every word that had been spoken throughout the trial. Elijah Johnson sat stiffly beside Victoria Langston, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. He stared at the judge, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Victoria, ever composed, placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's arm and gave him a small nod, silently reminding him that they had done everything they could. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. "This case," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention, "has presented this court with challenges far greater than I anticipated when it first came before me." He paused, glancing briefly at Elijah, then at Victoria, before continuing. "What began as a straightforward matter of alleged trespassing has evolved into something much more complex, a reflection of the systemic issues that plague our society." The room remained utterly still, the kind of silence where even the faintest rustle of paper seemed deafening. Judge Whitaker went on, his tone softer now, almost introspective. "I have spent years presiding over cases like this one, often dismissing them without giving them a second thought. But today, thanks to the arguments presented by Ms. Langston, I find myself compelled to reconsider not only my verdict in this case, but also my role in ensuring that justice is served fairly and equitably." Elijah's breath hitched. Could it be possible? Was the judge actually considering siding with him? Victoria sat perfectly still, her face betraying no emotion, though inside she felt a flicker of hope. She had seen judges waver under pressure before, but rarely did they acknowledge their own biases or admit fault publicly. This was uncharted territory. Finally, Judge Whitaker delivered his decision. "In light of the evidence presented and the absence of proper no trespassing signage required by law, I hereby rule that Mr. Elijah Johnson is not guilty of the charges brought against him." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some people clapped softly, while others simply sat in stunned silence. For Elijah, the moment was surreal. Tears welled up in his eyes as he struggled to process what had just happened. After years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and forgotten, someone had finally listened. But Judge Whitaker wasn't finished. Instead of ending the proceedings there, he took an extraordinary step, one that would leave a lasting impact on everyone present. "However," he continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure he had the full attention of the room, "this ruling does not absolve us of our responsibility to address the underlying issues that led Mr. Johnson to seek shelter in that building in the first place. Homelessness is not a crime. It is a failure of our systems, our policies, and sometimes even our humanity." He paused, looking directly at the prosecutor, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then, turning to the gallery, Judge Whitaker addressed the audience. "As a representative of the justice system, I must admit that we too often turn a blind eye to the struggles of those living on the margins of society. We punish symptoms instead of addressing root causes. Today, I vow to change that, at least within my sphere of influence." To everyone's astonishment, Judge Whitaker announced that he would personally reach out to city officials and advocate for increased funding for homeless shelters, affordable housing initiatives, and mental health services. "If we truly believe in justice," he declared, "then we must work together to create a society where no one feels compelled to break the law simply to survive another night." The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief and admiration. Never before had anyone witnessed a judge use their platform in such a bold and compassionate way. Even the bailiffs exchanged astonished glances, whispering about how unprecedented this was. Victoria allowed herself a small smile, knowing that her efforts had achieved more than just a favorable verdict. They had ignited a spark of change. For Elijah, the judge's words were a balm to his weary soul. As the courtroom emptied and reporters swarmed around Victoria and Judge Whitaker, Elijah stood quietly off to the side, clutching his Bible. A local news crew approached him, asking if he'd like to share his thoughts. At first he hesitated, unsure of what to say, but then summoning every ounce of courage, he spoke from the heart. "I never thought anyone would care about me," he admitted, his voice trembling with emotion. "But today, I learned that there are good people out there, people like Ms. Langston and Judge Whitaker who want to help. I'm grateful for that, and maybe this can be a new beginning for me." His words resonated deeply, both with those in the courtroom and with viewers watching the story unfold on television. By the end of the day, Elijah's case had gone viral, sparking widespread discussions about homelessness, inequality, and the power of representation. Social media lit up with hashtags like #Justice for Elijah and #Compassion over Condemnation, drawing attention to the broader issues Victoria had highlighted during the trial. Meanwhile, Victoria didn't waste any time capitalizing on the momentum. She held a press conference outside the courthouse, urging lawmakers and community leaders to take immediate action. "This victory is significant," she told the gathered crowd, "but it is only the beginning. We cannot stop until every person has access to safe housing, healthcare, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Justice isn't just about winning cases. It's about creating a world where cases like Elijah's don't happen in the first place." Inspired by her words, several organizations pledged support, promising to allocate resources toward programs aimed at combating homelessness. Even the property owner whose building Elijah had entered issued a statement, expressing regret for failing to post proper signage and announcing plans to partner with local charities to convert some of their unused properties into temporary shelters. As for Elijah, life began to transform in ways he could scarcely imagine. With Victoria's guidance, he connected with social workers who helped him secure transitional housing. For the first time in years, he had a roof over his head and access to meals, counseling, and job training programs. Though the road ahead would still be challenging, he faced it with renewed determination, buoyed by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitaker reflected on the day's events. He realized that this case had changed him too. No longer could he view defendants like Elijah as mere statistics or inconveniences. Each person who walked through his doors carried a story, a struggle, and a humanity that deserved recognition. From that day forward, he vowed to approach every case with empathy and a commitment to fairness. And so, what had started as a simple trespassing charge became a catalyst for change, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, acts of kindness, advocacy, and courage can shine brightly enough to illuminate the path toward a better future. In the weeks following Elijah Johnson's trial, the ripple effects of that fateful day in the courtroom began to spread far and wide. What had started as a seemingly ordinary legal case turned into a movement, a testament to the power of compassion, representation, and justice served with integrity. For Elijah, Victoria Langston, Judge Harold Whitaker, and countless others touched by the story, life would never be the same again. Elijah, once invisible to the world, found himself at the center of attention. News outlets across the country picked up his story, portraying him not as a homeless man accused of trespassing, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. Reporters interviewed him about his journey, asking how it felt to go from living on the streets to being celebrated as an example of humanity, triumphing over adversity. Elijah, still adjusting to his newfound visibility, answered honestly and humbly, "I'm just grateful," he said during one interview. "Grateful for Ms. Langston, for Judge Whitaker, and for everyone who cared enough to listen. This isn't just my victory. It belongs to all of us." True to her promise, Victoria continued advocating tirelessly for systemic changes to address homelessness and inequality. She partnered with local organizations, attended city council meetings, and even testified before state legislators to push for policies that prioritized affordable housing and mental health services. Her work inspired other attorneys to follow her lead, creating a network of pro bono lawyers dedicated to helping underserved communities. Victoria often reflected on how Elijah's case had reignited her passion for advocacy. "This is why I became a lawyer," she told a reporter, "to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, and to remind people that everyone deserves a fair chance." Judge Whitaker, too, underwent a profound transformation. The trial had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his role in perpetuating a system that often overlooked the most vulnerable members of society. Determined to make amends, he implemented new protocols in his courtroom to ensure that defendants like Elijah were treated with dignity and respect. He also began collaborating with social service agencies, connecting individuals facing charges related to poverty or homelessness with resources they desperately needed. During a community forum, he openly admitted his past shortcomings. "I used to think justice was black and white," he confessed. "But now I understand that true justice requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to challenge the status quo." The impact of Elijah's case extended beyond the courthouse walls. Inspired by Judge Whitaker's call to action, City officials announced plans to allocate additional funding toward building more shelters and transitional housing units. Nonprofit organizations launched campaigns to raise awareness about homelessness, encouraging citizens to volunteer, donate, or simply show kindness to those in need. Even businesses stepped up, pledging to hire formerly homeless individuals and provide job training programs. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn, proving that collective effort could create meaningful change. For Elijah, this period marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. With the help of social workers and counselors, he moved into a small apartment provided through a transitional housing program. For the first time in years, he had a place to call his own. A cozy space where he could hang pictures on the walls and cook simple meals without worrying about where he'd sleep next. Though the scars of his past lingered, he approached each day with renewed purpose. He volunteered regularly at a newly opened shelter, sharing his experiences with others who were struggling. "If I can make it, so can you," he'd tell them, his voice filled with conviction. "Don't give up. There are good people out there who want to help." One evening, as Elijah sat in his tiny kitchen sipping a cup of tea, he pulled out his worn Bible and flipped through its pages. A small note tucked inside caught his eye. It was a handwritten message from Victoria, given to him shortly after the trial. "You are stronger than you know, Elijah. Keep believing." He smiled softly, running his fingers over the words. They reminded him of how far he'd come and how much farther he could go. Meanwhile, Victoria remained a steadfast presence in Elijah's life, checking in on him periodically to see how he was adjusting. Their bond had grown beyond attorney-client relations. They had become friends. On one occasion, she invited him to speak at a fundraising gala for a nonprofit organization she supported. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of guests, Elijah shared his story with poise and grace. When he finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet to honor his courage. It was a moment of validation Elijah would carry with him forever. As months passed, Elijah's story continued to inspire people nationwide. Schools incorporated his case into discussions about social justice, teaching students about the importance of empathy and advocacy. Community groups organized drives to collect clothing, food, and supplies for shelters, using Elijah's name as a rallying cry. Even Hollywood took notice, with producers expressing interest in turning his journey into a documentary or feature film. While Elijah found the attention overwhelming at times, he embraced it as an opportunity to amplify his message. We're all human beings, deserving of love and respect. Let's treat each other that way. Back in Chicago, Judge Whitaker kept his word, working tirelessly to reform aspects of the justice system that disproportionately affected marginalized communities. He established monthly forums where residents could voice concerns directly to judges and policymakers, fostering transparency and trust. These efforts earned him recognition as a champion of judicial reform, though he insisted the credit belonged to those who had challenged him to grow, including Elijah and Victoria. By the end of the year, Chicago saw measurable improvements in its approach to homelessness. New shelters opened their doors, offering not just beds but comprehensive support services like counseling, healthcare, and job placement assistance. Affordable housing projects broke ground in neighborhoods previously neglected by developers. And perhaps most significantly, public attitudes began to shift. People started seeing homelessness not as a moral failing, but as a societal issue requiring collective solutions. For Elijah, the culmination of these changes came on a crisp autumn morning when he stood alongside Victoria and Judge Whitaker at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center. Funded partly by donations raised in Elijah's name, the facility aimed to provide resources and opportunities for individuals experiencing homelessness. As cameras flashed and cheers echoed around him, Elijah felt a deep sense of pride, not for himself, but for what they had achieved together. "This is just the beginning," Victoria said during her speech, gesturing toward the crowd gathered behind her. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but if we keep working together, we can build a future where no one has to endure what Elijah did. That's the kind of justice we should all strive for." As the event drew to a close, Elijah walked slowly back to his apartment, reflecting on everything that had transpired since that cold winter night when he sought refuge in an abandoned building. He thought about the judge who laughed at him, the lawyer who believed in him, and the countless strangers who rallied around him. Most of all, he thought about the power of second chances, the idea that no matter how broken life might seem, there's always hope for renewal. And as he settled into his chair, Bible in hand, Elijah whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. His journey had been long and difficult, but it had led him here, to a place of peace, purpose, and possibility. In the end, it wasn't just his life that had changed. It was the lives of everyone who had dared to believe in something better.